Hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm Jumpscareman. Let's begin. I grew up in a fairly old house in rural Pennsylvania. It had been built sometime in the late 1800s, and while my parents had renovated most of it, there were still parts that felt untouched. The attic was one of those places. It wasn't one of those finished attics with drywall and carpeting. It was just old wooden beams, loose insulation, and decades of forgotten boxes. When I was around 23, my parents went out of state for a week to visit family, and I stayed behind to watch the house and take care of our dog, Murphy. I had the place to myself, which honestly didn't bother me. I'd lived there my whole life. The first night was normal. The second night was when I heard it. It was just after midnight. I was downstairs in the living room watching TV when I heard a soft thud from above me. At first, I assumed it was the house settling. Old houses make noises all the time, but then I heard another sound. It was lighter this time, almost like careful footsteps. Murphy heard it too. He lifted his head immediately and stared up at the ceiling. Then he started growling, low and steady, the kind of growl dogs make when they aren't bluffing. I muted the TV and listened. 3 slow steps crossed the ceiling directly above the living room, then stopped. I remember sitting there, completely still, trying to convince myself it was a raccoon or maybe a squirrel. We lived near a wooded area, and animals sometimes got into old houses. Eventually, the noise stopped. Murphy relaxed, and I forced myself to do the same. The next morning, I went up to the attic with a flashlight. I didn't find anything unusual. No broken window, no animal droppings, no signs of entry. Just dust, boxes, and the same stale smell that had always been up there. I told myself I had imagined the footsteps. The following night, it happened again. This time, it was louder. I was in bed around 2 in the morning when Murphy suddenly jumped up and ran to my bedroom door. His ears were pinned back and he was staring into the hallway. Then I heard it. A slow, dragging sound directly above my room. It moved from one side of the ceiling to the other, paused, then moved back. I sat frozen in bed, listening as Murphy barked toward the ceiling. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. For a good 10 minutes, neither of us moved. Then the sound stopped. I barely slept that night. The next day, I called my dad and told him what I'd been hearing. He laughed and said it was probably squirrels. I wanted to believe him. That evening, I decided to set a trap. Not an actual trap, just something simple. I sprinkled a layer of flour across the attic floor near the pull-down ladder. If an animal crossed it, I'd know. I checked it the next morning. There were footprints. Human footprints. Bare feet. I remember my stomach dropping so fast it actually made me dizzy. The prints started near the far corner of the attic and ended right at the ladder opening, like someone had stood there looking down. I called the police immediately. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes. They searched the attic thoroughly. At first, they found nothing. Then one of them noticed that the insulation had been pushed aside near the back wall. Behind it was a narrow crawl space I had never known existed. Inside, they found a sleeping bag, empty water bottles, canned food, and a flashlight. Someone had been living up there. The officer asked if anything had gone missing recently. I told him I had noticed food disappearing, but I had blamed Murphy. Then he said something that still makes my skin crawl. There was fresh body heat in the sleeping bag. Whoever had been there had left only minutes before they arrived. The police searched the property but never found anyone. For the next few days, I stayed at a friend's apartment until my parents returned. We installed cameras, replaced every lock, and sealed off the attic access completely. About a week later, one of the cameras caught movement in the backyard around 3 in the morning. A man was standing near the side of the house, staring up at the attic window. He stood there for almost 2 minutes before walking back into the woods. The police were called again, but once more, they found nothing. We never saw him after that. What bothers me most is something the officer mentioned when he first searched the attic. He said the sleeping area had clearly been used for weeks, maybe even months, which means that while my family had been living there, eating dinner, watching movies, and sleeping peacefully downstairs, someone else had been living directly above us. Absolutely. There's something deeply unsettling about old houses. They creak, they settle, and they always seem to make noise at the worst possible times. Growing up, my parents used to joke that ours was alive. After what happened when I was 26, I stopped laughing at that joke. I had recently moved back into my childhood home in northern Ohio after losing my apartment. My parents had retired to Florida the year before, so the house had been sitting mostly empty. It was a large 2-story place with a partially finished basement and an old attic that nobody ever used. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. Quiet, even. Too quiet. Sometimes. I work remotely, so most of my days were spent alone. It wasn't long before I started noticing little things that didn't quite add up. Cabinet doors left slightly open. Lights turned on in rooms I hadn't entered. The back door unlocked when I knew for a fact I had locked it the night before. I kept brushing it off. Living alone in a big, empty house can mess with your head. Then the food started disappearing. At first, it was small things. A few slices of bread, leftover takeout, a can of soup. Could have sworn I hadn't opened. I blame myself. Maybe I was eating late at night and forgetting. It sounds ridiculous now, but at the time, that honestly felt like the most reasonable explanation. A week later, I came home from the grocery store and found the basement door open. I always kept that door shut. Murphy, my golden retriever, was standing at the top of the basement stairs, growling into the darkness below. Not barking, growling. His fur was standing straight up along his spine. I called his name, but he wouldn't move. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly walked downstairs. The basement was unfinished except for a small laundry area and an old storage room in the back. Everything looked normal at first, until I noticed the blanket. It was tucked behind the furnace, partially hidden from view. I had never put a blanket down there. When I pulled it aside, I found an empty water bottle, a half-eaten granola bar, and a pile of dirty clothes. I froze. Someone had been staying in my basement. I ran upstairs, locked myself in my bedroom, and called the police. 2 officers arrived within minutes and searched the entire house. They found no one, but they confirmed what I already knew. The items were recent. Whoever had been living down there had likely heard me come home and slipped out through the old cellar door that led to the backyard. The officers advised me to replace the locks immediately, which I did that same day. I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. 3 nights later, I woke up around 2:30 in the morning to Murphy barking downstairs. Not his normal bark. This was frantic. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed and crept into the hallway. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across my kitchen floor. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay where I was, but Murphy was downstairs and I couldn't just leave him. I moved down the stairs as quietly as I could. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the microwave clock. Murphy was standing in the living room, staring toward the kitchen. Then, a man stepped out from the shadows. He looked filthy. His beard was overgrown, his clothes were stained, and his eyes locked onto mine with a calmness that terrified me more than anything else. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not an apologetic one. A knowing smile. I swung the bat before he could take another step. I missed, hitting the doorway instead, and he bolted for the back door. Murphy chased him all the way outside. The police caught him 2 blocks away. It turned out he was homeless and had been living in vacant homes throughout the area. He had been entering mine through an old basement window that didn't fully lock. What still bothers me is what the officers found later. In the basement, hidden behind the furnace, was a notebook. Inside were pages filled with observations about me. What time I left for work, what I usually ordered for dinner, when I went to sleep, and one sentence written over and over again across an entire page. He still doesn't know I'm here. There's a road in eastern Colorado that cuts through miles of absolutely nothing. No gas stations, no houses, no lights, just flat land stretching farther than you can see. If you've ever driven through that part of the state at night, you know how isolated it feels. A few years ago, I was driving back home after visiting a friend in Kansas. I had left later than planned, and by the time I crossed into Colorado, it was already close to midnight. My phone had almost no signal, and there were long stretches where I didn't see another car for 20 or 30 minutes at a time. At around 12:45, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. That wasn't unusual at first. The road was straight and cars eventually caught up, but this one stayed behind me for a long time. It kept a steady distance, far enough that I couldn't make out the vehicle, but close enough that I always knew it was there. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Every time I changed speed, it matched me. If I accelerated, it accelerated. If I slowed down, it slowed down. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's easy to get into your own head when you're alone on an empty highway at night. Then I took an exit. I wasn't planning to. I just wanted to see if the driver would continue straight. He didn't. The headlights followed me down the ramp. At that point, my heart started pounding. The exit led to a small farming road with nothing around for miles. No businesses, no houses, no place to stop. I turned right. So did he. I drove another mile and made a left onto an even narrower road. He made the same turn. There was no more denying it. Whoever was behind me was following me. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but the call failed immediately. No service. I considered flooring it, but the road was dark and unfamiliar. One wrong move, and I'd end up in a ditch. The vehicle behind me suddenly accelerated. It pulled closer until its headlights completely filled my rearview mirror. I could feel my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Then it swerved into the opposite lane and pulled alongside me. It was an old black pickup truck. The driver's window rolled down. A man leaned out and started yelling, but I couldn't hear him over the wind. He pointed frantically toward the back of my car. For one insane second, I actually thought about stopping. Then his expression changed. He smiled. It was the most unsettling smile I've ever seen. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor. My car wasn't particularly fast, but adrenaline made it feel like a race car. The truck stayed right with me. He kept trying to pull alongside, occasionally drifting toward my lane like he wanted to force me off the road. I drove like that for what felt like forever, though it was probably only 5 or 6 minutes. Then, in the distance, I saw lights. A truck stop. I have never been so relieved in my life. I pulled into the lot at full speed, honking the horn as I came to a stop near the entrance. Several people turned to look. The black pickup slowed near the edge of the lot. For a moment, I thought the driver might actually follow me inside. Instead, he just sat there. Then he made a U-turn and drove back toward the highway. I went inside, shaking so badly I could barely explain what had happened. One of the employees called the local sheriff, who arrived about 20 minutes later. He took my statement and then asked if I had checked the back of my car. I hadn't. We walked outside together. Hanging from the underside of my rear bumper was a strip of cloth. It looked like part of a flannel shirt. The sheriff crouched down and pulled it free. There were muddy handprints on my trunk. According to him, someone had likely tried to climb onto my car while I was stopped earlier that night, probably at the rest area where I'd used the bathroom about an hour before. The man in the pickup may have been trying to warn me, or he may have been trying to get me to stop for an entirely different reason. I still don't know which possibility scares me more. The apartment was tiny, but it was cheap, and at 22, that mattered a lot more than comfort. It was on the second floor of an older building in Portland, tucked above a laundromat and a corner store. The place wasn't exactly nice, but it was mine. For the first month, nothing seemed unusual. Then I started noticing that my bathroom door would sometimes be open when I was certain I had closed it. It sounds insignificant, but I live alone, and I'm obsessive about little routines. I always shut that door before leaving for work because the sink had a slow leak and I didn't want my cat drinking from it. The first few times, I assumed I had simply forgotten. Then other things started happening. A kitchen cabinet left ajar, a dining chair slightly pulled away from the table. Once, I found my TV turned onto a static-filled channel I had never used. I laughed it off when I told my coworkers. One of them joked that I had a ghost. At the time, I almost wished it had been one. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to my cat hissing. Not the playful kind of hiss either. This was low, aggressive, and continuous. I sat up in bed and saw him standing in the doorway, staring into the dark hallway. His back was arched so high, it looked painful. I turned on my bedside lamp and listened. For a few seconds, there was nothing. Then I heard a soft creak from somewhere in the apartment. I called out, thinking maybe a window had been left open. No answer. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the building settling and went back to sleep. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on my kitchen floor. They led from the back window to the hallway. I don't remember breathing for a solid 5 seconds. I called the police immediately. 2 officers came out, searched the apartment, and found no one. They told me the window lock had likely been forced. The footprints, however, were partial and too smudged to be useful. They suggested that someone may have attempted to enter, gotten startled, and left. I wanted desperately to believe that. That night, I stayed with a friend. The following evening, I returned to gather some clothes before heading to my parents' house for the weekend. The moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. The apartment smelled different. Not bad exactly, just occupied. I set my bag down and immediately noticed that my bedroom closet door was open. I never leave it open. My heart started hammering so hard I could hear it. I backed toward the front door, but before I could reach it, I heard movement, a slow shifting sound, coming from inside the closet. I don't think I've ever moved faster in my life. I ran into the hallway screaming and nearly collided with my neighbor, who called 911. The police arrived within minutes. They found a man hiding in my closet. He had been living in the crawl space above my apartment and entering through an access panel hidden behind the closet wall. He had apparently been coming down when I was at work, eating my food, using my shower, and, according to the officers, sometimes sleeping in my bed. They found a small nest of blankets, empty food containers, and several photographs. Photos of my apartment, photos of me sleeping. I moved out the next day. To this day, I still can't sleep with a closet door open. Res me more. It happened in the summer of 2018 when I was working the night shift at a small hotel just outside Asheville, North Carolina. The hotel sat off a quiet highway surrounded by woods, and once midnight rolled around, it felt like the rest of the world had simply disappeared. I worked alone most nights. From 11 until 7, it was just me, the security cameras, and the occasional late-night traveler. Usually the overnight shift was boring. That was exactly why what happened stood out so much. At around 2 a.m, a man walked into the lobby asking for a room. He looked to be in his mid-40s, wearing jeans, a gray hoodie, and a dark baseball cap. Despite the warm weather, he had the hood pulled up. He kept glancing through the front windows toward the parking lot. I checked him in like normal, but as I handed him his key, he asked, "Do the room windows open?" It was an odd question, but not the strangest I had heard working there. I told him they only opened a few inches for safety reasons. He stared at me for a second, nodded, and headed upstairs. About 30 minutes later, the desk phone rang. It was his room. I answered with my usual greeting, but all I heard was breathing. Slow, controlled breathing. I said hello twice more before the line suddenly disconnected. I brushed it off as an accident. Then he called back 10 minutes later. This time, after several seconds of silence, he quietly asked, "How many people are working tonight?" I told him the front desk was staffed all night and asked if there was an issue with his room. He hung up without another word. At that point, I started paying closer attention to the security monitors. Around 3 o'clock, I spotted him standing alone in the parking lot. Barefoot. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't on his phone. He was just standing there, facing the lobby, perfectly still. I watched him for nearly a minute before he slowly turned and walked back up to his room. I remember thinking that as soon as my manager woke up, I was going to tell him about this guy. A few minutes later, the front doors flew open. A woman stumbled into the lobby, clearly panicked. She was barefoot, breathing hard, and crying so badly she could barely speak. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the parking lot. The first thing she said was, "Please don't tell him I'm here." I immediately locked the front doors and brought her into the back office. Once she calmed down enough to talk, she explained that she had stopped for gas about 20 miles away. A man in a black pickup had started talking to her while she was pumping gas. She ignored him and got back on the highway. A few minutes later, she realized he was following her. She took the hotel exit, hoping he'd continue driving. Instead, he followed her into our parking lot. I asked what kind of truck he was driving. "A black pickup," she said. The moment those words left her mouth, the desk phone rang. Room 214. I stared at the display for a solid second before picking up the phone and immediately hanging it back down. Then I called 911. While we waited for the police, I kept watching the security cameras. A minute later, the man exited his room and calmly walked downstairs. He crossed the parking lot and stopped directly in front of the locked lobby doors. He looked straight into the security camera mounted above the entrance. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, a knowing one. He slowly raised his hand and tapped on the glass 3 times. The woman behind me started sobbing. After a few seconds, he turned, walked back to his truck, and drove away without any hurry at all. Police arrived less than 10 minutes later. They took our statements and escorted the woman to another hotel in town. I figured that would be the end of it. The next morning, housekeeping entered room 214. Under the bed, they found a duffel bag. The police came back immediately. Inside were rope, duct tape, zip ties, gloves, and a large hunting knife. There was also a disposable camera filled with photographs of women at gas stations, rest stops, and motel parking lots. The detective later told me several of those women had already been identified. One had been reported missing. I never learned every detail of what happened after that, but I did find out the man was arrested a few months later in Tennessee after trying to abduct another woman from a motel parking lot. I quit the hotel not long after. Even now, I still remember the way he looked into that camera. He wasn't angry. He wasn't nervous. He looked amused, like if those doors hadn't been locked, the night would have ended very differently. A few years ago, I rented a small house on the outskirts of Boise, Idaho. It wasn't anything special, just a one-story place in a quiet neighborhood. The rent was cheap, the area seemed safe, and after a rough breakup, it felt like exactly what I needed. For the first couple of months, everything was normal. Then I started waking up exhausted. Not just tired, completely drained, like I hadn't slept at all. At first, I blamed stress. I was working long hours, and moving into a new place had been hectic. Then I noticed other things. My toothbrush would be wet when I hadn't used it. Kitchen drawers were slightly open in the morning. Once, I found the TV muted on a channel I never watched. I live alone, and I'm meticulous about my routines. Little things stand out to me. I started wondering if I was sleepwalking. To test that theory, I downloaded a sleep tracking app and set my phone on the dresser facing my bed. The app only recorded when it detected movement or sound. The next morning, there were 3 recordings. The first 2 were nothing, just me rolling over and the sound of my dog snoring. The third clip was recorded at 3:17 a.m. At first, the room looked normal. I was asleep under the blankets. The audio was silent except for the hum of the ceiling fan. Then, after about 15 seconds, my bedroom door slowly opened. A man stepped inside. He was thin, wearing dark clothes and a baseball cap. He moved carefully, like he had done this before. I remember the feeling when I watched that clip for the first time. My entire body went numb. He stood beside my bed for nearly a full minute, just watching me sleep. Then he leaned down and picked up my phone. The video cut off right there. I called the police immediately. They arrived within minutes and searched the entire house. At first, they found nothing. Then, one of the officers checked the crawl space access in the hallway closet. The panel had fresh scratches around the edges. When they opened it, they found bedding, food wrappers, empty water bottles, and several items that belonged to me. Whoever had been living there had been entering my house through an exterior vent beneath the back porch. The officer believed he'd been staying there for weeks, possibly longer. What made it even worse was what they found tucked inside the bedding: a small notebook. Inside were pages detailing my daily routine, what time I left for work, when I usually went to bed, how long I showered. There was even a sketch of my bedroom, but the final page was the part that still haunts me. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "Still hasn't noticed me." I moved out that same day. A few weeks later, police arrested a man in a neighboring county after he was caught living inside another woman's attic. They confirmed it was the same person. I still use security cameras in every place I've lived since then, and even now, whenever I wake up in the middle of the night, I immediately check that my bedroom door is still closed. It happened last October, just a few weeks before Halloween. My wife had taken our 2 kids to spend the weekend with her parents, which left me alone at our house in rural Michigan. Normally, I would have gone with them, but I had to work Friday morning, and honestly, the idea of having the place to myself for a couple of days sounded pretty great. Our house sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by woods on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor was far enough away that you couldn't see their porch light at night. During the day, it was peaceful. After dark, it felt completely isolated. That Friday night was uneventful. I ordered takeout, watched a movie, and let our German Shepherd, Cooper, sprawl across the living room floor. Around 11, I checked that all the doors were locked, turned off the downstairs lights, and headed to bed. At some point, I woke up to Cooper growling. It wasn't his normal bark at a squirrel or a deer outside. This was low, steady, and deeply aggressive. The kind of sound that immediately tells you something is wrong. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. 1:40 a.m. Cooper was standing rigid at the foot of the bed, staring at my bedroom door. His ears were pinned back, and the hair along his spine was standing straight up. I sat there listening, trying to convince myself he'd heard an animal outside. Then I heard it. 3 slow knocks, not on the front door, not downstairs, on my bedroom door. For a second, I genuinely couldn't process what I'd heard. I was supposed to be alone. Cooper lunged toward the door, barking so violently that I thought he might break it down himself. I grabbed the handgun from my nightstand and shouted, "Who's there?" The house went completely silent. A moment later, I heard footsteps moving away down the hallway. Slow, unhurried, like whoever had been standing outside my room wasn't panicked in the slightest. I called 911 immediately. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way and instructed me to stay where I was. While I was still on the phone, Cooper suddenly stopped barking. He moved to the window and began whining, which somehow felt even worse. I carefully pulled back the curtain. Standing at the edge of my backyard, just beyond the reach of the motion lights, was a man. He was dressed entirely in dark clothing, and even from that distance I could tell he was staring directly at my window. I whispered to the dispatcher what I was seeing. Then the man slowly raised one arm and pointed toward the side of my house. Before I could even react, he turned and disappeared into the woods. The police arrived about 8 minutes later, though it felt much longer. They searched the house first. No one was inside. Then they searched the property. A few minutes later, one of the officers called me outside. Near the side of the garage in the soft mud were 2 separate sets of footprints. One set led from the woods toward my house. The other circled around the back. The officer looked at me and asked, "How many people did you see?" "1," I said. He nodded grimly. There were at least 2. That realization hit me harder than anything else that night. While I'd been staring at the man outside my window, someone else could have been anywhere on my property, maybe even inside my house just minutes earlier. The officers searched the woods until nearly dawn, but never found anyone. I barely slept over the next several days. I installed additional floodlights and checked my security cameras obsessively. Then, 4 nights later, one of the cameras captured something that still makes my stomach turn. At 3:07 a.m., a man walked out of the tree line and approached the side of my house. He stood directly beneath my bedroom window looking up. About 15 seconds later, a second figure emerged from the woods behind him. The 2 of them stood there silently for almost half a minute. Then they turned and walked back into the darkness. Police increased patrols in the area, but whoever they were, they knew how to avoid being caught. About a month later, authorities arrested 2 brothers in the next county over after a homeowner caught them trying to enter a detached garage. Inside their truck, investigators found maps, binoculars, bolt cutters, and a notebook filled with addresses. Mine was one of them. Next to my address, someone had written, "Dog inside, owner armed, return with both." My wife and I put the house on the market that winter. We moved 6 months later. I still live in Michigan, but I will never again own a house surrounded by woods. And every single night before I go to bed, I make sure every door is locked twice. It happened when I was 24, during my first year working as a paramedic in Arizona. I had already seen my share of disturbing calls, but nothing has ever stayed with me like this one. It was just after 2 in the morning when dispatch sent my partner and me to a welfare check at a remote house outside Tucson. A neighbor had called after hearing screaming earlier in the night. The caller said the house had gone quiet afterward, which somehow worried him even more. The address was nearly 30 minutes outside town, down a dirt road with no streetlights and no nearby homes. The kind of place where, if something happened, nobody would hear it. As we pulled up, the house was completely dark, except for a single porch light swinging in the wind. There were 2 cars in the driveway, both unlocked, both with their doors slightly ajar. That immediately put us on edge. We announced ourselves several times, but no one answered. The front door was already open. Protocol said to wait for law enforcement, and we did. A sheriff's deputy arrived about 10 minutes later, and the 3 of us entered together. The house looked normal at first glance, but there were small details that felt wrong. A television was still on in the living room, playing static. A plate of food sat on the kitchen table, untouched. One chair had been knocked over. Then we heard it. A faint tapping sound. 3 taps. A pause. Then 3 more. It was coming from upstairs. The deputy drew his weapon and told us to stay behind him. As we climbed the stairs, the tapping stopped. At the end of the hallway was a closed bedroom door. The sound had definitely come from inside. The deputy pushed it open. The room was empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. Then my flashlight landed on the closet. The door was shaking. Not violently, just enough to notice. The deputy opened it. Inside was a woman curled into the corner, clutching a baseball bat so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her face was covered in tears, and she was hyperventilating so badly I thought she might pass out. She kept repeating the same sentence over and over. "He's still here. He's still here." We got her downstairs and into the ambulance while the deputy radioed for backup. Between sobs, she explained that she'd been home alone when she heard someone knocking on the back door. When she looked outside, no one was there. A few minutes later, she heard footsteps upstairs. She locked herself in the closet and called her husband, but he didn't answer. Then she heard screaming. Not her own. A man's scream, then silence. That was when the neighbor called 911. Police searched the house for nearly an hour. They found her husband in the garage. He was alive but barely conscious, with severe head trauma. According to investigators, he had come home, heard someone inside, and confronted an intruder. The intruder attacked him with a tire iron. What makes this story so disturbing is what happened next. The police found muddy footprints leading from the garage back into the house. Whoever assaulted him had not fled immediately. He had gone back inside. They discovered him hiding in the attic crawl space above the master bedroom. He had been lying there silently while we searched the house, while we treated his victim, while his wife sat in our ambulance just feet away. He was armed with a knife, several zip ties, and a roll of duct tape. The deputy who found him later admitted that if the woman had opened that closet door even once, she probably would not have survived the night. Her husband recovered after multiple surgeries. The intruder was eventually linked to several home invasions across southern Arizona. I left emergency services years ago, but certain sounds still get to me, especially slow knocking. 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more. It happened 3 years ago when I was working as the closing manager at a grocery store in western Pennsylvania. The store was in a small town, the kind of place where most people know each other, and the overnight shift was usually quiet. We closed at midnight, and by 12:30, the last employee had left. Part of my job was walking the building one final time before setting the alarm. I had done that routine hundreds of times. That night, everything seemed normal. I checked the stockroom, locked the employee entrance, and made my way through the aisles toward the front registers. The store was silent except for the hum of the refrigeration units. As I passed aisle 12, I heard something metallic hit the floor. It wasn't loud, but in an empty store, it might as well have been a gunshot. I stopped immediately. At first, I thought one of the shelf tags had fallen off. Then I heard footsteps, slow footsteps. Someone was walking on the other side of the aisle. I called out, assuming a customer had somehow been left inside after closing. No response. The footsteps stopped. I rounded the corner. The aisle was empty. I stood there for several seconds trying to listen over the pounding of my own heart. Then, from 3 aisles over, I heard the unmistakable squeak of a shopping cart wheel. That old, uneven squeak every grocery store seems to have. I walked toward the sound, half annoyed and half nervous. When I turned into the next aisle, there was a shopping cart sitting in the middle of the floor, empty, gently rocking back and forth. I had personally collected every cart before locking the doors. I pulled out my phone and called the police. While I was on the line, I heard movement near the back stockroom. I made the mistake of going to look. The stockroom lights were still on. Pallets were stacked everywhere, creating narrow pathways between them. As soon as I stepped inside, I knew someone else was there. You can feel it. I heard breathing. Close. Too close. Then a man's voice came from somewhere behind the shelves. "Stores closed?" I ran. I didn't answer. I didn't look back. I sprinted all the way to the front entrance and waited outside until officers arrived. They searched the building for almost 40 minutes. They eventually found a man hiding inside one of the large cardboard balers near receiving. He had somehow climbed into the empty chamber and pulled the hatch mostly shut behind him. What police discovered afterward was even worse. He had been in the store for hours. Security footage showed him entering just before closing and deliberately avoiding cameras. He spent nearly 2 hours hiding in employee-only areas, watching staff as they cleaned and closed. In his backpack, officers found gloves, zip ties, a hunting knife, and a handwritten note containing the names of 2 female employees who regularly worked the closing shift. One of those names belonged to a cashier who had left only 15 minutes before I heard that first noise. The detective later told me they believed he had intended to wait until everyone was gone except one person. I quit that job 2 weeks later. To this day, I can't walk through an empty store late at night without feeling like someone is standing at the end of the aisle, just out of sight. It happened in January of 2021 during one of the worst snowstorms our town had seen in years. I was 29 at the time, living alone in a small cabin about 40 minutes outside of Duluth, Minnesota. I know what you're probably thinking, and honestly, looking back, living that far from anyone else was a terrible idea. At the time though, it seemed perfect. I worked remotely, loved the quiet, and the isolation never really bothered me until that night. The snow had started early in the afternoon and only gotten heavier as the evening went on. By 10 o'clock, the roads were buried, the wind was howling against the walls, and the power had already flickered twice. I was sitting in the living room with my dog Ranger, watching the storm through the front windows when the lights finally went out for good. The cabin fell completely silent except for the wind. I lit a few candles, grabbed some blankets, and figured I'd just ride it out until morning. Around midnight, Ranger started growling at the front door. At first, I thought he had heard a branch scraping against the porch. Then came 3 knocks. Slow, heavy, deliberate. My stomach dropped instantly. Nobody should have been out in weather like that. I called out, asking who it was. No answer. Just the wind. Then, after about 10 seconds, 3 more knocks. Ranger was barking now, backing away from the door while still staring at it. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and looked through the front window. No one was there. The porch was empty, covered in fresh snow. No footprints. Not a single mark anywhere. I told myself it had to be a branch, even though there weren't any trees close enough to reach the cabin. I tried to ignore it. About 15 minutes later, my cell phone rang. No caller ID. I answered, expecting maybe a family member checking on me. All I heard was static. Then a man's voice. Very calm, very clear. "I know the power is out." I hung up immediately. Before I could even process what I'd heard, the phone rang again. Same no caller ID. I didn't answer. It rang a 3rd time, then a 4th. Finally, it stopped. I was already dialing 911 when I noticed something outside. A light, moving through the trees. It was faint at first, weaving slowly between the snow-covered trunks. A flashlight. Someone was walking toward the cabin. I relayed everything to the dispatcher, but the storm had already made the roads nearly impassable. She told me deputies were on the way, but it could take time. The flashlight disappeared behind the garage. Then I heard footsteps on the porch, not knocks this time. Footsteps, slowly crossing from one side to the other. Ranger was losing his mind. I retreated to my bedroom, locked the door, and kept the shotgun pointed at the hallway. For nearly 20 minutes, I heard movement in the house, cabinet doors opening, drawers sliding, the unmistakable creak of boots on wooden floors. At one point, whoever it was stopped directly outside my bedroom door. I could hear breathing on the other side. Then, softly, a voice said my name, not shouted, whispered. That was the worst part, because I had never told the dispatcher my name. I didn't answer. I didn't move. Ranger stood between me and the door, snarling. A minute later, I heard the sound of the front door opening and closing, then nothing. Deputies arrived almost 40 minutes after my first call. They found pry marks on the back door and muddy snow tracked throughout the cabin. Several kitchen drawers had been opened. Nothing appeared to be stolen, but one of the deputies found something on my living room table that absolutely chilled me. A photograph. It was an old Polaroid of me, taken months earlier at a local diner. I had never seen it before. Written across the bottom in black marker were 4 words: "Finally found you alone." I sold that cabin before spring arrived. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for more true horror every week. And if you have a terrifying story of your own, send it to the email in my channel's profile. Your story might be featured in a future video. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't the ones you can see. Good night.